there. Thanks for joining us for our Summer Kids Club. I'm Stacy here at the Aquarium of the Pacific, and we're going to take a look at a kelp forest and conservation associated with that kelp forest. Now, youth scientists, thank you again for joining us. I hope that you've had a chance to check out a few of our other episodes as well that happen around this time of day, every Monday through Friday. And we will have more next week, too. So the Summer Kids Club will continue on to next week. Now, today's episode is really taking a look at this beautiful exhibit that you see here behind me. This is a representation of a real dive site that is a kelp forest. Now, for those of you who are familiar with kelp forests, you may already know a lot about them. But for those of you who are not quite as familiar, I'm hoping we can explore today and learn some things together. So, I want you to take a good look at the exhibit that you see here behind me, our blue cavern exhibit, and try to make some observations. What do you notice? What are the qualities of this exhibit? Well, this fish isn't going to help very much because you can't quite see the habitat behind the fish. But, that's part of the habitat, right? Habitats include not only the non-living things like rocks and water, but also the living things like the seaweed, the giant fish that we just saw right there. So all of that is kind of put together to create this habitat. Now, this blue cavern exhibit is an exhibit here at the Aquarium of the Pacific. It's a very big exhibit, actually. 142,000 gallons of water, which is really incredible. And lots of different fish. It's also an exhibit that represents a habitat close to us here in Long Beach. So we do have kelp forests right off the coast here in Southern California. Now, as you make these observations, I also want you to think about different questions that you might have about this habitat. Is there anything that you wonder? Now, if you have those questions, if you make observations and you'd like to share it with us, we would love to get them. All you need to do is send us a text. The number's right down there, 562-286-1838. Now, you can text us at any time during this program. So now, later, whatever that might be. So take note of that number. Now, for those of you who are watching this after the fact, if you're watching this on demand, and you still want to share with us or ask questions, you still can. But we do ask that you do this via email instead. And that email address is down there as well. It's live@lbaop.org. All right. So now that we have that, let's take a look at this exhibit. What are some of the things that you notice about this habitat? Qualities of the habitat. What makes this different than another ocean habitat that you might be familiar with, like maybe a coral reef or a sandy bottom habitat? For those of you who don't know what that is, it's pretty self-explanatory. The bottom of the ocean is sandy. There's a wetland habitat. But again, what we're looking at here is a kelp forest habitat. So what are some of the things that you notice that make this different than those other habitats that I just listed there? Well, one of the main things, kind of the namesake of this whole habitat, is the kelp. So as you can see here, there's a lot of seaweed that's in here. Now, this exhibit here actually does not have the real stuff. Real kelp is it's really good at growing. In fact, in ideal conditions, if it has everything that it needs to be healthy kelp, it can grow up to 2 feet in a single day. Now, for those of you wondering, what does kelp need to survive? Well, it needs the stuff that we have here in Southern California. Our ocean here is kind of on the cool side. That's number one. All right, so if you were to go to the beach around here, put your feet in the water, you might notice that the water's a little bit chilly. On a day like today, where it's super warm outside, it's refreshing almost, right? So it needs cold water. Another thing that kelp needs is flow. So that means the water needs to be moving around a bunch, because that water movement it's good for it. It kind of shakes it up a little bit. It also makes sure that the water that's nearby is a little bit fresher, because that water's moving around. So that's a really good thing. It needs to be nutrient-rich waters. And it actually helps that the kelp is there. It helps it to be more nutrient-rich. One of the things that you'll notice around here is that our waters look kind of green. And I know a lot of us think, ew, it's green, it's polluted, it's gross. But actually, that green color is what we want to see. It means that there's tons and tons of nutrients in that water. The reason it's green is because there's a lot of microscopic algae just like the kelp here, but microscopic, itty bitty, floating around in the water. So if you had a little bit of the water, it would look clear. All of it, all like together, is what makes it look green because there's so much of that phytoplankton, that microscopic algae. So this is a good picture of what some of the phytoplankton might look like. Of course, they're microscopic, so you couldn't see it with your eyes, but we were able to get a picture of it much larger. All right, so that's really interesting, right? So it needs to have cool, clean water. It's nutrient rich. It moves a lot. Sunlight, absolutely necessary. Why do you think sunlight is so necessary for a thing like kelp over here? Well, it is in many ways similar to a plant. They're different in that they don't have a root structure like, plants do. If you think about a tree, right? Trees have roots. Roots go in the ground, and they're incredibly needed. But for kelp, it's different. Algae don't need roots. Now, the thing that looks kind of like roots for kelp is actually just designed to hold it down to the ocean floor. And so all of that kind of gnarled, branchy looking root-like structure is really there just to hug a rock. So that's why you see lots of rocks in a habitat like this. Now, we do have an observation that came in that there's lots of animals. I agree, there's a ton of animals. What's amazing is that we're only seeing a handful here. There's even more that you would find in this kelp forest. So when you have a healthy kelp forest, tons and tons of kelp, that's the basis to this ecosystem. That's how you get so many different animals. Now, this is kind of interesting. Not only are you going to find vertebrates, which are animals with backbones like the fish here, but you'll also find a lot of invertebrates. Not only are you going to find big animals like our giant sea bass here, but you're going to find small animals too. Some of these animals are so small that you can barely even see them. They're itty bitty and they're hiding in rock crevices and things because when you're small, you might get eaten. So the kelp forest habitat is incredibly lush, and a really healthy kelp forest has a ton of diversity, a ton of different animals that call it home. And in fact, there's probably more algae than just kelp. There's going to be different kinds of algae, some that might even be a little bit smaller and closer to the rocks. So that's how you would know that it is a healthy ecosystem, is when you find lots and lots of different living things in that environment. Now, why kelp forests? Why do all these animals hang out in a place like this? What do you think? Take a moment. Why would animals hang out in a place like this kelp forest? Well, for one, if there's a lot of animals living here, that means if you're a predator, there's a lot of food to eat. And I don't know about you, but I sure like being around food. So I would want to be where food is easy to get to, right? And that's exactly what animals want to do. They want to make sure that there's food nearby so that way they could survive. Now, predators will be able to eat other animals, but do you think any animals eat kelp? Absolutely. There are some animals that eat kelp. So in a lot of ways, the kelp here is a producer, right? Just like plants on land. That's why they needed the sunlight. It needs the sunlight. It needs the nutrients in the water. It needs that flow. It needs to be cool. All of those things to be healthy and grow. But all that growth is because it can make its own food. So it uses that sunlight to photosynthesize. And it's basically making its own energy. It's kind of the basis of the food chain here in a kelp forest. Now, the green water, all of that microscopic algae, that's also part of the food web of a kelp forest as well. But now what eats that? Well, we're going to focus on the kelp, right? What eats kelp? Can you think of anything that might eat kelp? Do you think fish eat kelp? Do you think there are any invertebrates that might eat kelp? Potentially. Now, it looks like somebody saw some sharks in this habitat as well, and you can absolutely find sharks in this habitat. Not just one kind of shark, but several different types of sharks can call a kelp forest home. Now, for those of you who are thinking sea urchins eat kelp, absolutely. Sea urchins are giant kelp eaters. Oh, okay. So the sea urchins aren't giant, but they eat a lot of kelp. That's what I mean by a giant kelp eater. This here is a sea urchin. This one, in fact, is called a purple sea urchin. You can see how it got its name. And this purple sea urchin is sitting on its favorite food. This is kelp. Now, make a couple observations of this urchin. How do you think it eats kelp? Do you see anything about it that helps you know how it's going to eat? Not really. It's really tough to see, right? And that's because the eaty part is its mouth, and it's kind of on the bottom there. So you don't really see it very well when you have an upper view like this here. But basically, this sea urchin is an invertebrate that has lots and lots of tiny feet called tube feet. And those tube feet allow it to walk around on the ocean floor. It doesn't have fins, so it's not a swimming animal. So this is an animal that's going to crawl around on the ocean floor looking for algae to eat. Now, the algae that it's going to eat is really any kind of algae. It doesn't have to be kelp, but they really do like kelp. It's like a preferred snack. And the part of the kelp it's going to eat is the part it can reach, which is not the flowy part up at the top, but it's kind of the stuff on the bottom. So it's crawling around. It's getting the kelp that's on the bottom. Do you remember what the base of the kelp is used for, the hold fast? It's used to hold the kelp down, right? And so when the urchin eats it, it's going to eat the part that holds the kelp to the ocean floor. Urchins can eat so much of it that the kelp can actually dislodge from the ocean floor and float away. So then that whole strand of kelp is gone. But in a kelp forest, there's a ton of kelp all around. So one strand missing is not that bad, right? Well, urchins are big time eaters of kelp. They're not the only ones. There are other animals out there that eat kelp as well. Have you heard of a snail, one of my favorite snails, called an abalone? An abalone is a kind of snail. It's a very charismatic snail that also crawls around on the ocean floor munching on algae. And so this is what it looks like here. Did you notice this animal here, or did it look like a rock to you? It totally looks like a rock to me, but it's still an animal. And it does have a mouth. It does have a face. It's just hard to tell which end is which because it's hard to tell. But it does have a little mouth part of it. And this mouth bit of this snail is really amazing. It has these kind of grindy looking teeth. It kind of whirls almost. And it's called a radula. A lot of snails have these things, the radula. And basically when it's on top of the kelp, that whirly mouth, the radula, scrapes up the kelp and chops it up into small enough bits that they can ingest it. And then they have now eaten kelp. But again, these are animals that are crawling around on the ocean floor. So that means whatever they can reach is what they're going to get. They're not going to float up to the little wavy bits of that kelp either. So a lot of animals that are eating this kelp are hanging out kind of on the bottom here. Okay, so we know that things eat kelp. That's one of the reasons why kelp is important. Why else is kelp important for this habitat? Well, animals not only need food, but they also need shelter, right? And so having lots and lots of kelp is going to provide them with a lot of really great shelter. Now, let's take a look at like a video, maybe one of our videos of any kelp forest here. All right, so we have our kelp forest here, and what do you notice in this video of a kelp forest? Lots of little critters. Well, these little critters aren't that little, are they? They are sea lions, and these sea lions are flitting around in the kelp. So they can hang out in the kelp playing because it looks like a great obstacle course, right? I bet you they can find lots of really great food here. And for a sea lion, they don't typically hide a ton among the kelp, but they could potentially. If there was a predator nearby, Do you think it would be easier or harder for this sea lion to survive if a predator was hunting it and it was in the kelp? Now, it seems like it'd be a little bit easier, right? Because they're so agile, they can turn and twist and dodge, and they can maybe use that kelp as obstacles for that predator, so the predator can't quite catch it. So that's going to be really important. Now, another thing too is that maybe it's a smaller animal that needs a place to hide because maybe it doesn't move so fast, like say a crab. So there are lots of different types of crabs that live in a kelp forest. And all of those crabs are not the fastest movers. So if something wants to eat it, like say maybe a seal, not a sea lion as much, but like a seal would want to go maybe after a crab or an otter or something like that, or maybe a large fish, you need to be able to hide and hunker down. So then you're going to have something like camouflage. This kelp provides some animals with a place to hide. Now, this kelp crab here looks like the color of kelp. You almost can't even see it unless you kind of know that it's there. There are other crabs, like decorator crabs, that literally decorate their shells with little bits of algae and other shells and things for them to blend in. So they can hide using camouflage, which is a pretty amazing thing. So now we're really understanding the importance of a kelp forest to this habitat, or the importance of kelp to a kelp forest habitat. It's really the primary producer, right? It's the basis of the food web of a kelp forest. It provides animals with shelter, with food, with a place to hang out and play. All of those are really important things when you are trying to survive out there in the ocean. Now, a long time ago, there was a threat to kelp forests, and that threat was an imbalance of a kelp forest. Now, habitats have this kind of delicate balance. If you think about a food web, right? Not just a food chain, but a food web. All of the things in that habitat are interconnected. The kelp is necessary. The crab is necessary. Otters are necessary. Even urchins are necessary. All of those things are part of what makes a kelp forest a kelp forest. If you take one of those animals away, maybe like sea otters, it's going to throw off the balance of this ecosystem. Now, sea otters in particular are important to the balance of a healthy kelp forest ecosystem, especially the ones that rely on sea otters, like the ones that you find in Central California. Now, this here is a southern sea otter, so for those of you who are wondering how cute and adorable they are, there you go. But they do have little attitudes, so you definitely do not want to hug a sea otter for so many reasons. But these animals were incredibly important to the health of kelp forest habitats. Now, the reason why is because they're what you call a keystone species. They're keeping other animals in balance, the population of those other animals in balance, so that the kelp forest can be healthy and everything in there can thrive. Taking away sea otters throws off that balance. Sea otters are big time eaters. One of the ways they survive is by eating 25% of their body weight. That means not that they weigh 100 pounds, but 25% of 100 pounds is 25 pounds. And I'm talking about like an everyday 25% of their body weight kind of thing. So they're eating a ton of food. And the things that they can eat are things like sea urchins and abalone. Remember earlier we were talking about sea urchins and abalone eating kelp, right? So these otters are keeping this kind of animal in check. Now, urchins especially are really great at reproducing. When they reproduce, they can reproduce hundreds, if not thousands of babies in one go. Now, if all of those babies survived into adulthood and had more babies, just imagine how many sea urchins you would end up having. So you need to have predators out there who can eat some sea urchins to keep their population under control, or else they can eat up an entire kelp forest ecosystem. Now, this is actually what was found. Sea otters eat sea urchins, a lot of sea urchins. But sea otters were also hunted almost till extinction. In fact, it was thought that southern sea otters were extinct at one point. Thankfully, there was a small pocket of southern sea otters that still existed in a very remote area. And so that population was able to increase and grow with proper protection. So now we actually have quite a lot of sea otters out there eating a lot of food. And that's a really good thing. They're keeping the populations of kelp eating animals in check in Central California, which is where you're going to find a lot of sea otters. Now, wait, I said here in Southern California, off the coast of Long Beach, we have kelp forests, but we don't have sea otters. Well, that's because there are other animals that also eat sea urchins. Not a lot, though, because you have to have the right adaptations in order to eat them. Did you see how pokey they were? They were crazy, right? Well, sea otters are smart enough, clever enough, and they have the right adaptations to help them actually break the outer shell of an urchin. I have a representation of what that kind of looks like. This here is what you call an urchin test. So this is just under the surface of all those spines, and it is pretty fragile. But with all those spines there, not many things can get through. Well, otters have these really great little teeth, and they're able to go toward the bottom where the spines are a little bit smaller and usually crack this enough to open it up so they can eat the bits on the inside. So most of the animals that eat urchins are really going to try to go after the bottom because it's a little bit easier to get to. Okay. Now, there are some Southern California animals who do eat sea urchins, and those are things like lobsters. So we do have West Coast lobsters. They are a little different. They don't have big claws like Maine lobsters do, but these lobsters are still really good at eating sea urchins. There's also these fish called sheephead. Now, California sheephead are crazy looking. They kind of stand out in a kelp forest, actually. We were talking about camouflage earlier. Not these ones. They don't have camouflage. In fact, this here is a California sheephead. You'll notice that it is transitioning to male. We'll talk about that in a second, because it has kind of this pink center and a darker head and a darker tail and this white chin. Now, these male California sheephead have a really big teeth and a fairly strong jaw that allows them to get past all those spines, crack open an urchin, and eat them. So we do want to make sure that we have these large fish around. We also want to make sure that we have those lobsters around. They're the ones that are keeping the population of urchins in check. All right. Now, I said earlier that they're kind of interesting fish, that this one's in transition. Let me explain what I mean by that. A sheephead wrasse is part of this family of fish called wrasses. Wrasses are interesting because when they hatch from an egg, they all hatch as female, all of them. And at some point in their life, they might turn into a male. Now, for the sheephead, it's usually, I think it was somewhere about 2/3 to 3/4 of the way through their lifespan. They make this transition into a male. For other wrasses, they only transition into a male if they are the dominant female. That means they're usually one of the bigger females. And if there are no other males around, maybe it was eaten, maybe it decided to move to another part of the ocean. But if there's no males around, the largest female tends to turn into the male. So it's a really interesting way to make sure that you have both males and females in a population. That's one way that these wrasse fish can do that. Okay, so we are keeping things under control to make sure that we have a healthy kelp forest. But what about people? How do people contribute? What can we do to help a kelp forest? Well, there's a few things that we can do. Remember how we need this balance, right? We need to have a balance of a kelp forest, of any habitat for it to be healthy. Well, in order to help, especially if you eat seafood, is to make sure that the kind of seafood you eat is considered sustainable seafood. Now, what that means is that the way it's fished, how much is fished, all of that is okay for the ocean. It doesn't make the population plummet. It doesn't destroy the habitat. Sustainable seafood help our oceans have balance. So we want to make sure that we choose sustainable seafood. But how do we choose it? Well, there's a couple of different things you can do. Number one, if you choose to eat seafood that is either fished or farmed in the United States, it is likely to be sustainable because the United States has a lot of regulations on how you can farm and fish fish out there. And so if it's from the US, you're probably okay. Another thing is just trying something a little different. A lot of people who eat seafood eat things like shrimp, tuna, and salmon. Try something different. Because if all of us eat shrimp, tuna, and salmon, that means we sure are taking a lot of shrimp, tuna, and salmon out of the ocean. Well, let's not do that. Let's try something different, something like halibut, like sea bass. Those are a few different types of seafood that are often fished here in Southern California that are actually quite tasty. And another thing you can even do is to look for certifications. There's a couple of different certifications out there, like Marine Stewardship Council, that basically put a stamp on something because they know how that fish was fished. And so they can say, yes, this is sustainable. Another thing that we could do is to support marine protected areas. Now, the exhibit that we showed you earlier, Blue Cavern, is actually a representation of a real dive site, and that dive site is a marine protected area. Now, marine protected area is basically a chunk of the ocean that is protected. And there's different levels of protection, but if you think about like a national park, right? You can go to a national park and hike around and see the beauty of it. But you can't hunt in a national park. You can't mine in a national park. It's a chunk of land that is for the wild and for people to just enjoy in a way that doesn't hurt it. And that's basically what marine protected areas are like too. It's a chunk of the ocean that that is kind of protected, right? So that we can have some parts of the ocean that are going to be healthy and balanced. So those are just a few things that you can actually do to help a place like a kelp forest. Now, we don't really have as many issues with otter populations declining anymore. There's kind of, they've been protected. So there's the fur treaty. They were hunted for their fur before. And there's a fur treaty that basically said you can no longer hunt for otters. There's also this thing called the Marine Mammal Protection Act. And that Marine Mammal Protection Act protects marine mammals off of U.S. coasts from being disturbed even. So another reason why you should not try to hug an otter. They are protected, besides the attitudes. There it is, that little attitude. So those are some different things that were put in place to kind of protect our otters. But there's still threats out there. There's still a lack of balance in some parts of our ocean, actually in a lot of our ocean. So here in Southern California, we have, or here at the aquarium, we have a program where we are breeding abalone because abalone are really important parts to our kelp forest ecosystem. And in fact, abalone, these ones, are an important part of a sea otter's diet. So eating abalone helps sea otters be healthier. But we also want to make sure that there's abalone around too, right? So unfortunately, abalone were something that were fished out of the ocean in huge numbers many years ago. And so the population went down really fast. And in some areas, the population was so sparse, there were so few out there that they couldn't even find each other to breed and have baby abalone. And that's one of the reasons why their numbers really took a dive. So here at the Aquarium of the Pacific, we are part of this program along with a handful of other places, other aquariums and laboratories out there that are trying to breed abalone, more specifically the white abalone. That's this one right here, and eventually grow them up so they're a little bit bigger. They might have a better chance to survive and release them out into the ocean. So these are some of the conservation projects that the aquarium here is doing. There have been a few other conservation projects that other places have done, like trying to raise kelp and then planting the kelp out into kelp forests. So that way the kelp forests are a little bit healthier. These are all ways that people are trying to help out our oceans, especially the ones here close to us in Long Beach. Now, my youth scientist friends, I do want to thank you again for joining us. If you are interested in learning a little bit more about kelp forests, I encourage you to try out the activity that's associated with this kelp forest and conservation session. All you need to do is go to our website where you might have found this video, and there is a link to some more activities. These activities include taking a look at our Blue Cavern exhibit and making observations of your own. Another really cool thing is being able to use that to help you watch the behaviors of the animals. I love doing that sort of thing. Picking a fish, like maybe this big guy right here, and watching it. What is it doing? Why do you think it's doing that? That's another way that you can learn more about the animals that you might be interested in. And also included in that activity is creating a fish of your own. So when you take a look at this fish, there are many different characteristics of that fish that make it that fish specifically. So this is a really cool activity for you to create your own fish and maybe create a story that goes along with that fish. How would it fit into an ecosystem like the one that we have right here? Well, thank you again for joining us. We do have one more session today, one more session, the last session of the week. So I hope that you stick around to learn a little bit about how we care for the animals that we have here. But if not, join us again next week where we have more sessions of the Summer Kids Club. Thank you.